In the annals of medical history, there are cases that defy explanation. But there's one file, kept in the archives of a small convent in southern Italy, that terrifies skeptics to this day. The subject was a Capuchin friar named Francesco Forgione, known to the world as Padre Pio. From 1918 until his death in 1968, exactly 50 years, this man carried open, bleeding wounds on his hands, feet, and side. According to medical calculations, he lost approximately 1 cup of arterial blood every single day. For a normal human being, this would lead to severe anemia, collapse, and eventually death within weeks. Yet Padre Pio lived. He worked 18 hours a day. He never became anemic. And the strangest part? The wounds never infected. In a time before antibiotics, open wounds were a death sentence, prone to gangrene and rot. But doctors who examined him, including the rigorous Dr. Luigi Romanelli, reported something impossible. The blood didn't smell of decay. It smelled of roses, violets, and tobacco. The church, cautious and skeptical, sent doctor after doctor to expose him as a fraud. They used iodine, sealed his hands in bandages, and monitored him 24/7. They found no acid, no self-inflicted cuts, no trickery. They found only a biological impossibility. But the physical blood was just the visible part of the mystery. The real reason the Vatican kept a close watch on him wasn't the wounds, it was the war he was fighting when the lights went out. While the sun was up, Padre Pio was a prisoner of the people. Crowds pulled at his habit, begged for miracles, and lined up just to touch him. But when the sun went down and the heavy wooden doors of the monastery were bolted shut, he became a prisoner of a different kind of war. It is easy for modern skeptics to dismiss stories of demons as metaphors for mental illness or depression, but the other friars living in San Giovanni Rotondo couldn't dismiss what they heard with their own ears. The monastery was a place of absolute silence, yet night after night, the brothers sleeping in the cells adjacent to Padre Pio were woken by the sounds of a brutal brawl. They reported hearing the crashing of furniture, the shattering of glass, and the dull thuds of a body being thrown against the stone walls. It sounded, they said, like a wrestling match with a giant. Padre Pio wasn't just having nightmares, he was being assaulted. In his letters to his spiritual director, Father Benedetto, he described these entities not as vague shadows, but as physical monsters. He called the devil Barba Blue, the Bluebeard, or the Ogre. He wrote, "These devils don't stop striking me even when I'm exhausted in bed. They tear the blankets off me, and then they beat me until I can barely move." One specific incident was recorded in the monastery chronicles. Late one night, a terrifying crash shook the hallway. When the friars rushed to his cell, they found the room in chaos. The iron bed frame was twisted, books were scattered, and Padre Pio was lying on the floor gasping for air, with a deep gash on his forehead and his eyes swollen shut from punches. He hadn't tripped, he hadn't had a seizure. He told his superiors that a great black dog with eyes like fire entered the room, stood on his chest to suffocate him, and then thrashed him around the cell like a rag doll. Why was this happening? Why would God allow his faithful servant to be beaten by the enemy? The devil himself gave the answer during these attacks. He screamed at Pio, demanding he stop hearing confessions. He shouted, "Stop stealing souls from me, or I will kill you." The bruises on his face the next morning were visible to everyone at Mass. They were the war medals of a man who was literally physically fighting to snatch souls from the grip of hell. But the devil is cunning. When he realized he could not break the friar with physical beatings, he changed his strategy. He stopped using claws and started using bureaucracy. He infiltrated the very heart of the institution Padre Pio loved the most, the Holy Catholic Church. In the 1920s, rumors began to reach Rome. Anonymous letters accused the friar of being a hysterical fraud, a womanizer, and a chaotic cult leader. They claimed he used carbolic acid to burn holes in his hands to mimic the wounds of Christ. The The Vatican, terrified of a false prophet leading the faithful astray, launched an investigation that was colder and more ruthless than any medical exam. They sent Father Agostino Gemelli, a brilliant psychologist and Franciscan, to evaluate him. Gemelli never even examined the wounds properly, yet he reported back to Rome that Pio was a psychopath and a self-mutilator. What followed was a betrayal that sounds like a spy thriller. In a shocking move, enemies within the clergy planted hidden microphones inside Padre Pio's confessional. They wanted to catch him soliciting women or speaking heresy. They recorded his most private moments, violating the sacred seal of the sacrament to find dirt on a saint. They found nothing but grace. Yet the hammer fell. In 1931, the Holy Office issued a devastating decree. Padre Pio was banned from saying Mass in public. He was banned from hearing confessions. He was ordered to live in total isolation. For 2 years, he was a prisoner in his own home, forbidden to see the people who loved him. This was the devil's masterstroke. He expected Pio to rebel, to leave the church, to start his own schismatic sect, just like Martin Luther had done centuries before. Pride would have destroyed the saint. But Padre Pio did the one thing the devil cannot understand. He obeyed. When the order came, he didn't scream, he didn't fight. He simply looked at the crucifix and said, "God's will be done." He accepted the punishment from his sweet mother church without a word of complaint. And in that silence, he won the war. The silence imposed by the Vatican could not hold back the truth forever. In 1933, the ban was lifted, and Pope Pius XI admitted, "I have not been badly disposed towards Padre Pio, but I have been badly informed." The prisoner was free. But just as the church doors opened, the world plunged into the chaos of World War II. Ironically, it was this war that brought Padre Pio to America. Southern Italy was a strategic zone, swarming with Allied forces. Among them were thousands of American GIs, young men far from home, terrified of death. They had heard whispers of a holy man in the mountains who could perform miracles. They climbed the rocky path to San Giovanni Rotondo, not as conquerors, but as pilgrims seeking hope. It was during this time that one of the most baffling military reports of the war was filed. American bomber pilots, flying missions to destroy German ammunition dumps near the monastery, reported a phenomenon that defied aerodynamics. As their B-24 Liberators approached the target zone, the pilots saw a figure floating in the air, right in front of their cockpits. It wasn't an angel with wings, it was a monk in a brown robe, arms outstretched, signaling them to turn back. Terrified and confused, the pilots claimed their instruments malfunctioned or their planes turned away on their own. No bombs were ever dropped on the village. When the base commander, General Nathan Twining, heard these impossible reports, he decided to fly a mission himself. He returned shaken. He too had seen the flying monk. After the war, many of these pilots traveled to the monastery to see the man in person. When General Twining walked into the sacristy, Padre Pio looked at him, smiled, and said in perfect Neapolitan, "So, you are the one who wanted to blow us all up." The general fell to his knees. He recognized the face. It was the man he had seen in the clouds. These American soldiers returned to the United States, carrying rosaries blessed by Pio and stories that sounded like science fiction. They told of a priest who didn't just hear your confession, he told you your sins before you could speak. If a soldier tried to hide a shameful act, Pio would smell the sin, describing it as the stench of rotting garbage, and roar, "Get out, you are not sorry." He was terrifying in his holiness. He wasn't a soft, gentle counselor. He was a spiritual surgeon who cut deep to remove the cancer of sin. And yet, he built more than just faith. In the middle of a poverty-stricken mountain range, he built the Home for the Relief of Suffering, one of the most advanced hospitals in Europe. The man who fought the devil every night used his days to fight disease, proving that true mysticism always leads to charity. By September 1968, Padre Pio was 81 years old. His body was exhausted from 50 years of constant pain and spiritual warfare. On September 22nd, he celebrated his final Mass. Footage from that day shows a man who was already halfway to heaven. He collapsed at the altar, unable to stand, yet he finished the sacrifice. That night, in his cell, he whispered his final words, "Jesus, Maria, Jesus, Maria," and then he died. But the moment his heart stopped, the final mystery began. For half a century, his hands, feet, and side were open wounds. Doctors had stated that if they ever healed, the scar tissue would be massive. Yet, when the brothers examined his body minutes after death, they froze in shock. The wounds were gone, not just closed, gone. There were no scars, no red marks. The skin on his hands was as smooth and unblemished as a new